The Last Human Voice, the SAG-AFTRA Digital Voice Replica Agreement.
I'm Dr. Mathilde Pavie. I'm a lawyer and an expert in intellectual property law, ethics and new technologies.
I'm Marcus Hutton, actor, voice artist and chair of the Equity Audio Committee.
And I'm Annette Rizzo, voice artist and union activist on a steep learning curve.
Well, in this short talk, we're talking about the recent agreement struck between SAG and the AI company Replica Studios. We may call it the Replica deal for short.
For background, SAG-AFTRA is the US Actors Union, and the acronym SAG is the Screen Actors Guild. AFTRA is American Federation of Television and Radio Actors. And they're responsible for negotiating collective agreements between their members, so anybody with a SAG membership, and companies or groups of companies.
And Replica, the other party to this deal, is an AI company who creates synthetic voices. And from what I understand, they create and make available voice replicas for other film and video companies to use in their own productions. And the idea is that they would use Replica Studios technology to voice characters, for example.
To be really clear, this is distinct from the TV or theatrical agreement from last year, from 2023, that was struck between the union and the Alliance of Motion Picture and Television Producers. That was approved in December 2023, and that also includes AI replicas for acting work. We are going to cover that topic in another episode very, very soon, but for now we're going to stay on the Replica deal, which is hot off the press at the moment of recording. The full text of the agreement is available. You can read it for yourself in full on the SAG-AFTRA website. But for those of us who would prefer getting a shorter digest, I'm going to turn to you, Marcus. Marcus, what are the key points of the Replica deal?
And before you go, Marcus, it's worth saying that SAG-AFTRA had us all on the edge of our seats the day before publishing the agreement because they had put out a press release announcing a groundbreaking agreement with an AI company applicable to AI voice work, which is a very kind of hot topic at the moment in the field. So groundbreaking, let's see.
Yes, okay, well, picking through this. The Replica deal is in place for 1 year for SAG and Replica to experiment. Now, that's SAG's own words. At the end of the year, SAG and Replica will be free to walk away or reconvene and prolong or agree new terms. So the deal requires that Replica ensures basic minimum standards and that they're respected when they work with voice actors to create voice replicas. The first of these is that the consent of the actor to make the replica needs to be express, clear, and conspicuous. The second is that the making and use of the voice replica needs to be remunerated. Now, here, SAG is relying on some of the rates we see used in the US for what they call interactive media work, and games fall into that. And those rates have been buyout rates, sort of a reasonable hourly rate, but there's no royalties or anything attached to those. So that's something we can come back to in a minute, because that's something that is worrying in some ways. So the voiceover would receive a studio fee for the time spent producing the recording to train the models to create the replica, and that's a minimum session of 4 hours paid, and additional remuneration based on both the length of speech produced with that model and the type of character the replica is narrating. The third bit of the agreement is that the use of voice actors' sound recordings is based on a license, and that these will be destroyed after the replica is made. So it's just a research and development agreement. Anything commercial beyond that would have to be made under another agreement. So there's mention of scratch tracks. I'm a bit confused about that. That scratch tracks normally just means a demo in my head. What do you think, Matilda or Annette?
I just presumed that the scratch track is just like the placeholder. And I don't know about the games or for film, but very often when I'm doing corporate work, a client will send me what they'll call the scratch track. So they'll send me the visuals, and it's already got a voice laid on it, but it's not my voice. It's just somebody in the office, or sometimes it's an AI voice.
Yeah.
And it's, just to give you a sort of sense of tone and pace, more about the pace and the timing, so that they could create the visuals around it. And then I've got to match the timing, but I put my own spin on it. So I presumed that was what they meant. I don't know. Is that right?
Well, if we look at the terms of the agreement, we're not very much enlightened, because I think the word shows up once in the context of the license, and I'd have to go back and double check. But if we look at the FAQ documents that was put out together with the terms put out by SAG-AFTRA, it says that the agreement also sets compensation terms for pre-production uses, in quotes and quotes, often referred to as scratch tracks, and that they say this work that is often done internally during a game's development and for which our members are rarely employed, apparently this time falls under the scope of the agreement. I'm still not clear as to what that means.
So what it means then is that from the sounds of it, is they if they want to sort of sketch in some characters and try some lines or whatever, they can use it to do that. They can use it, but they can't publish it, but they can use it as it's a bit like using what in a music's called a temp track. Rather than getting a composer in to write the score, you just put a piece of music on that sort of suits the mood or whatever. So I suppose it's laying out the use. That's what it must mean then. It's laying out that they can use it to develop games with, but they can't actually publish that.
Because if we look at the FAQ, the kind of rules applied to the use of scratch tracks are the same as all of the other bits of recordings that fall under research and development. And I suppose because the whole deal is about R&D, then that covers scratch and all.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the agreement tries to cover three different ways of doing sort of an AI voices. It defines, first of all, it's a foundational model, and the agreement defines a foundational model as a voice model trained on large volumes of anonymized data files that does not have an individually identifiable unique characteristic, such as sound, tone, rhythm, or cadence, that remains consistent and recognizable when used to synthesize speech. So a foundation model is not intended to be user-facing. And again, not too sure what this is, but a foundational model, I presume, is going to mean cadence, intonation, whether somebody's angry, whether they're happy, whether they're sad, sort of speech rhythms, that they can use all that data to that's what the foundational model is. Then they've got something called a voice model, which is defined as means a computer-generated AI model or electronic creation or recreation of a voice or voices created using new or existing sound recordings or anonymized data files of more than one individual, regardless of media or source, that can be used to synthesize speech. So this is so they can take an individual actor's audio files, or they can create a hybrid model of a number of people put together into one voice. That is another kind of weird one as well, in terms of where that might go, I suppose. And so a voice model is distinct from what they've talked about in their third bit, which is a voice replica, which is designed as a voice model trained on recordings of a specific individual. So that Annette or me or Mathilde, that's creating something that's going to duplicate, sound like us, and has individually identifiable unique characteristics such as sound, tone, rhythm, or cadence that remains consistent and recognizable when used to synthesize speech. So a foundation model, I suppose, is all the bits that make up natural sounding speech. A voice model could mean a hybrid voice of lots of people, and a voice replica is a replica of one individual. And last but not least, the deal only covers internal research and development, in which it includes demos, no external release or publication, internal to the company, replica by replica only. And should replica or the performer want to commercialize the R&D, or should it want to go out on a published title, then this has to be arranged under a new negotiation. Phew, there you go.
Now, let's clarify within the deal what's agreed on for internal use and what's agreed on for external use, because I, for one, on this was confused, and I've seen also online many people not being entirely sure what is agreed under R&D, so to speak, internal use, and what's covered under the external use for the replica deal. Let's say that the replica deal is the overall framework agreement with all of the terms agreed between the company and the union, and we need to split that into two. The first component and the first set of terms cover internal use by the company of SAG-AFTRA members, otherwise known as performers, to do work for them in order that they create the foundation models, the voice models, and the digital replicas, as described by Marcus just now. And that first part of the agreement is known as the development agreement. It's for internal use only, and it's basically to develop the underlying tech as well as the digital replica that goes with the performer's voice that is unique to that performer. That cannot be used externally unless there is another agreement between the company and the performer, but especially between the union and the company. Now, they've already done one agreement on external use, and that agreement comes second. It is the second set of terms, including within the overall replica deal, that covers the external use of the digital replica by the company with a third party, like a video game company, a film production company, and so forth. And there are different sets of remunerations and protections and limitations that comes with part two of the replica deal, the external use terms, if you like, and license. Now, there is a key difference in the remuneration levels, for example, because the way remuneration is calculated and due to the performer under the development agreement is different to the remuneration due to the performer under the external use agreement or the license agreement. So for the development agreement, from what I understand, is that a performer will be remunerated for the recording time spent in order to deliver and hand over the voice data, the recordings necessary to train the foundation models, create the voice models, and create the digital replicas. So the remuneration here is entirely thought in terms of time spent in a recording or equivalent if the performer provides pre-existing audio, and that will especially be the case if the performer is dead and no longer with us and their estate or their agent is providing audio from archives of previous portfolio. So for that, there will be a time-based level of remuneration and minimum rates applicable. Now, for the external use of the digital replica created by the company, Replica Studios, and made available for other third parties to use, licensees in effect, then a different set of compensation or remuneration is owed or due to the performer under this deal. And that remuneration has two components. First component, you need to pay the performer for the time spent in a studio in order to produce recordings that will be needed or that would have been needed in order to create the lines of text. And the other component is that the remuneration is also to be calculated in light of the type of characters that's being voiced, whether it is a featured or principal voice or whether it is an atmospheric voice, for example, and the number of lines prompted using the digital replica. And those two components make up the compensation that is owed to the performer for the external use of the digital replica created by the company Replica Studios and made available to third parties, licenses, film productions, video games, and so forth. And if you look at the rates, they are aligned with existing rates and licenses and agreements practiced by SAG-AFTRA under the Interactive Media Agreement. And I think it's fair to say that the overall deal and the language of the internal use / development agreement, as well as the language of the external use of digital replica and licenses agreement, part two, you could see that SAG-AFTRA expects that more licenses for external use will be needed to cover other market uses in this space of work, and that the details of those obviously are to be watched, to be confirmed. But these are the two components of the overall Replica deal we need to keep in mind as we're having a conversation about the strength and the weaknesses of this new bargained agreement.
Right. So you as the individual who is signing the contract with the company, you get paid your fee and your voice can be used in any of those
Yeah.
models.
All of them.
Or all of them. Okay.
Is that right, Meta? Yeah.
That's right. And how I understand the agreement is stacked, so there are different permissions and licenses depending on which model your data lands in, foundational, voice, or replica. I understand that it is the use of the replica that, for a particular character, for a particular project, then depending on what it is used for, how long, how many lines, how many characters of speech it's narrating, then you may have remuneration tagged on to that. And that, of course, relies on a good amount of transparency flowing back, between the company, how much they're using the voice models, plural, the voice replica, back to the performer, back to the union, back and through then to the performer.
So I'm a little bit baffled. I know that you've got to start somewhere where you're making agreements, but a 1-year deal, is this a bit of a stretch to call it groundbreaking?
I mean, quite. It's hardly addressing all of the hot and pressing issues, especially in voice work in relation to AI, and it's not keeping up with its time to the extent that now most companies that are developing voice synthesis technologies with AI or that capacity, they also have marketplaces. They're starting to have voice libraries, so they are, fully developing the external use of the tech and of the voices in a synthetic form. So we're kind of running behind a little bit here. And whilst it's a step in the right direction, I'd call it a baby step rather than groundbreaking or breaking new grounds, personally. Now, SAG's got FAQ comments on this very point, actually, and it's saying that it's groundbreaking because for the first time it covers scratch tracks, which means that R&D demo phase before a game is actually signed off to be produced and released, and you then bring union performers to do the work of a character once it's got the green light to go ahead, I suppose.
So they looking at those FAQs, I read it as this is groundbreaking because it's new. So which you can say about anything. Any time anything's new, you're breaking new ground. Therefore, it's groundbreaking.
Yes, what's being done isn't particularly new because this is what text-to-speech companies have been doing for a long time. But I suppose the fact that it's a union deal is new. But is it groundbreaking? Yes, I suppose so.
Oh, we are being very harsh, aren't we?
It does sound a little bit like a bit of trumpeting on both sides, But there you go. But it's not doing anything very radical for the industry. It's what's been happening for a while anyway.
Oh, right. So now if we want to keep it short, we thought we'd share and discuss our pros and cons about the Replica deal. And because we're all coming at it from a different perspective, and I think it's also fair to say that we're looking at this deal out of context. Like, we don't have examples of projects that have been run or that are illustrating in practice what those terms mean. And we are a little bit floating as to, in terms of the definitions that are given between the foundation models, the voice replicas, because many of the people in the industries or even pieces of regulations are using different definitions against those words. So that caveat in mind, let's think about the kind of key points of the agreement. What are our pros and what are our cons? Marcus and Annette, do you want to start with cons or shall we start with pros?
Yeah, I think let's start with the cons. Well, first of all, I think what's clear from as we've just kind of tried to fudge our way through that. I mean, what's not clear from the agreement is what form the experimenting or research and development takes. I mean, obviously, it does allow for creating hybrid voices, but hybrid voices are perhaps the thing that frightens us all the most, which is that, okay, you can sort of do a deal where you're being cloned as yourself, but actually if you create a generic female character voice and it's got thousands of different voices sort of creating that voice, then that means there is no There is no job. There is no digital double going out and doing the work. It's just a completely synthetic creation, and we've seen that with photography, haven't we? We've seen AI models. They are just composites of the attributes of people's noses, eyes, and everything else, and that's going to be very, very difficult to unpick. And I suppose I think it's Replica that are getting the good deal here, because I suspect that what they really want is they want access to top tier talent, and they're going to get that through SAG. They're going to get, very experienced and good professionals, so they get very good data to work with. And of course, they also have the surety that it's all going to be legal. There's been so much litigation with AI and so many problems that I would imagine that the investors in these companies are getting twitchy. So a union deal is unusually for our sector, where people reluctantly want to make union deals. At least in the UK, it seems that that AI is a good place to make a deal, because you get the certainty that because there's no legislation, that you can carry on with it. And I suppose that unions, I mean, Equity certainly is in this position. They are between a rock and a hard place with AI. I mean, if you look at the kind of Twitter feeds on this SAG Replica thing, people are being extremely vitriolic about it. Members don't want it. Equity members, on the whole, they're very nervous about AI. They don't want it to happen.
Interesting.
And that makes it very hard for a union to sell a technology to members which is threatening perhaps to take away their jobs, or to promote it as a new revenue stream if it's a case of getting paid once and then not working in the future. But on the flip side of that, and I know this only too well with the Audio Committee, if you don't collectively bargain, if you don't talk to these engagers, then you don't get to put the safeguards in place, and you don't get to advocate for artists. So, and of course, any attempts to block new technologies in the past have not worked for unions. So, they've got to go with trying to make these deals and hope for the best, I suppose.
Yeah, I think you have to do something. I think
Yeah,
doing
can't do
nothing is not
nothing.
an option. I
Yeah.
think my cons, and as you'd expect from me, probably a little bit more basic. I find some of the language quite confusing. For example, around the possibility of, because it's an internal use only, and then it starts talking about the possibility of external or licensed use. And again, looking at it, and I'd say if you haven't looked at it yet, go and take a look at it and see for yourself. Um, it looks like they're trying to negotiate to make sure that at least there is the requirement that the company then has to go back and renegotiate. But if SAG-AFTRA expects members to be able to navigate this, then they are going to have to release some fairly detailed supporting notes and documentation to make it accessible to people. And when they define external use, this is another of the things that always troubles me, really sets my teeth on edge. External use, here we go, is the definition. External use includes use of the digital voice replica in an audio or audio-visual work in any new media now known, fair enough, and hereafter devised. And that bugs me. Don't include or hereafter devised. If it's something new that no one's thought of yet, let's come back and renegotiate that and put that in your definition. If it's something new, we all have to come back to the table again. And then my last one, the fact that it specifies only 1 year, I think that can be construed in both a positive and a negative way, because it means that after a year, we all come back and say, yes, no, good, bad. And I think, Matilda, you're going to talk a little bit more about that as well. So after that year, the developer needs to go back to the performer for renewed consent. Renewed consent is good. I'm happy with that. What bothers me, and maybe this applies to all contracts, not just this one, but I can imagine there being pressure right from the initial contract that only those who express their intention to agree that they will consent again after the initial term has expired might land the job in the first place. I don't know how you tackle that possibility legally, but I'm sure that is potentially one of the problems.
And I think there's something else here, which is that, once you've pulled all the data that you need for your building your foundation model or whatever, and it does say that the foundation model will be destroyed, but once you've kind of figured out how to do that, I think you're going down the road to just pulling humans out of the, for some work, particularly the lower end work, maybe the smaller parts, the smaller roles or whatever, that you're just pulling humans. You eventually, we're going to be pulling humans out of the equation altogether. So anyway, just to build on what you just said.
No, you've made great points that I generally agree with. I think my cons are the limited scope. I mean, we've said it's a step in the right direction, but it's still behind its time. It's limited in length. Now, that could be good because it gives also SAG-AFTRA to an opportunity to course correct if terms that they've agreed to, they've realised kind of backfires or they have unintended consequences. But a year is not that long to see those and assess those.
That's true.
For me, is the confusing language or categorizations they've made between foundation models, voice replicas. I'm not fully wrapping my head around that because it's taking a slight departure from the terminology or the definitions that other well-known instruments like the EU AI Act follows from just what I can read. What I find really puzzling is the use of recording time as a point of reference, as this unit of measure that will then pay the performer, because to me that screams of buyout, and a buyout, well negotiated, can work, but that's not the history or the track record buyouts I've had. There is a reference point to the number of lines or characters that the voice replica, when once used in connection to a character, is used to create, produce, or narrate. I don't exactly know. When is a computer telling lines? Do you say it's narrating? I don't know if that should be kept for humans. What does it? Do you say it speaks? It doesn't quite speak. It doesn't perform either. It says things. Maybe that's what I should say. So I mean, I'm already slipping into the pros. What I really want, and I understand that they're not necessarily able to do it when they publish, is that I want to see a real life example applying those principles so we can see what they mean and we can see what the figures come up to when using research and development, when the usage is being tracked of the voice replica to narrate or to bring to life, so to speak, a character. How much money lands in the performer's pocket and how much control do they have in practice? Because this idea that then for any external use, Replica can negotiate or bargain with the performer in good faith and notify the union in that process. Yeah, unless the union's involved, I don't see a performer, being in the position of commanding good terms on their own unless they're well known and they have, they command a higher bargaining power. Those are my issues, and obviously dittoing what you've said already. So limited in scope, limited in use, using time as a unit of measure that's going to quickly date, because we're thinking character based feels also a bit underwhelming. It's a tricky spot to be in. Now, I've already started mentioning some of the pros, the positives of this deal. What's on your list for that, Marcus, if anything?
Okay, but quickly before I turn to the pros, there's another con in this I can see, which is that some of this seems to be a reaction by SAG to the idea that, under American law, people are talking about fair use, that data can be scraped legitimately, and everything else. Now, that's under American law, and this is always my problem with SAG agreements. SAG agreements impact the rest of the world because a lot of these AI companies and film companies and big production companies are all in America, and they all do it through the prism of what American law allows. Whereas I would say that the EU AI Act offers protections to performers anyway. Not that the EU law would counteract that idea that something is fair use. So I don't know, really. Are we looking at this through the prism of the American courts and legislative framework? So that's a negative. Is this a knee-jerk reaction by SAG based on what they worry that the American law is going to do? I don't know, Mathilde. Do you think that's even relevant, that point?
I think so. I mean, I think it's the dominance of US export in the creative industries. Like US productions are driving a lot of the work and are driving the global economy as far as a lot of the video game, film, creative industries. Obviously, I'm hardly breaking any news here, but as a result, business that is done in the US under US law tends to create practice that we see exported in other countries, even where the protections are higher for artists, and that creates that big friction where people who are engaging with US practices and laws in mind are a bit surprised, being like, coming to Europe, for example, and seeing higher protection in terms of equitable remunerations or certain contractual terms that are deemed oppressive in the EU or even the UK bloc for the time it's spent in the EU and deemed unenforceable. And so I agree, that's a risk. Fair use in the US understanding of that doctrine is broader and more generous, I would argue, than in the EU and many other countries.
For sure, yeah.
And perhaps this is trying to claw back or preserve whatever it can, whilst the bargaining position might be slightly stronger if it was used by performers and their unions in the EU bloc and then other countries that observe similar standards. So yeah, it's a risk, especially as SAG with this deal comes out first, that sets a tone that could have been set a little bit higher had we waited a little bit, or had we made this
I think so. I think
bigger.
I think the bar could have been higher. But you did ask about positives, so I suppose I did
Yes.
suppose. Well, the positive I can think of is that there is collective bargaining going on. That there is, that there is establishing the principle that people need to be paid and they need to give consent. But sorry, I'm back into negatives again, because I think consent is a bit of a chimera, really. You only need to consent once, and you can be consenting for lots of things. So I don't know. I don't know if these deals are ever going to be satisfactory for what the technology wants. But I suppose it has established the idea of at least getting paid and at least giving permission, and that's about it as far as I'm concerned. Annette?
Thanks, Scrooge. I think, Look, I did go through and specifically looking for positives, and you can find them, and nothing's ever perfect. So every time you come up with a positive, you go, but also, so. Having complained that some of it was confusing, there is some clarity. I think they have done their best in some areas. There's lots of mentions of what the company cannot do and what it must do. For example, the requirement for the company not only to cease using the replica at the end of the contract period, but also to delete it. And I think it's important that we understand, because we've had a conversation amongst ourselves whether that means just to delete the finished model or to delete the initial data. We think it means to delete the underlying data, so hopefully that's the case. That's a positive. The contract includes damages for late payment. Maybe that's a standard with SAG-AFTRA, I don't know, but the fact that was laid out clearly, I thought was pretty good.
That's the law, isn't it? Just everywhere.
Yes, but you know what it's like if it's not in the contract.
Yeah, it's true.
If you ask your average actor or voice actor, when did they last go to a contract and demand that from someone who's a late payer? I mean, we see it all the time in the online forums.
Yeah,
This
it's
company,
true.
that company hasn't paid me their, a month late, 3 months late, 6 months late. The requirement for transparency. We've talked about this before. So many companies have descended into that murky of approach of, we don't really know where it's going to go. Maybe we're going to do this with it. Maybe we're going to do that with it. We might want to change the usage in the future. So maybe we can just pay you this one fee now to cover everything forever. So putting that requirement for transparency in there doesn't mean it can't be better. It doesn't mean that maybe, following the EU model might not be an improvement on that, but it is there. So that's good. And really, as you've said already, Marcus, just reaching a deal with the union. It's not an end in itself if the terms are unfavourable terms, but having the precedent that we've made the effort to have a negotiated agreement and that's a good thing for everybody, I think that's quite important. And I also think it is quite important to try to pick through these deals as they happen and to feed back to the unions negotiating them and saying, actually, this could be better and maybe you need to look at that next time and all that sort of stuff. But I do think we also have to remember that there are individuals and that we ourselves have been those people on occasion. And actually, it's quite important to support the people that are actually undertaking these negotiations, because it's the devil's own job. It's important to try and find positives and be clear about the negatives. That's my opinion anyway. Mathilde.
I agree. I mean, I think, and to your last point about the fact that, yes, a deal can always be improved. They've probably given it their best. We don't have any insider knowledge or insights about the context of certain terms and what they started from, what they landed at. We don't know that direction of travel the negotiations took. So there may have been practical challenges that we don't know about because we weren't in a room. and that actually were quite significant to get around. Who knows? So we can certainly give them that bit of benefit of the doubt / compassion. On my list of pros, I have all the ones you've listed. I would say that it's good to see put in practice those key principles that equity stood behind, that many unions stood behind with SAG, of consent, compensation, control, and transparency on the application of this tech to the asset and the skills that performers bring to that industry, but also just the wider economy. So that's good, and we need more of that, and that's happening. And it's also perhaps showing that some companies see that as good business to do it that way. So we need more of that momentum and that thought. I think what I'm really keen to see, especially in the video game industry, is that practice of transparency, because my, albeit limited experience of the last few years, looking at deals, making deals, getting out of deals, connected to video games, is that compared to publishing, compared to music, compared to acting, I'm sorry to say, video game folks, it's a hot mess. I mean, the kind of the practice of keeping track of tracks, no pun intended, but keeping tracks of what's been recorded for what character, for what release, of what game, in what franchise, is a mess. And it doesn't need to be. I don't exactly know where it comes from, but it means that a performer's never quite sure. It seems to me that when they go in the recording booth, they don't really know what scripts goes with what games, goes with what contracts, and goes against what payment, residuals, or buyouts, etc. So if you don't know that, you don't know if the deal you've made is a good deal and if it's being respected. So if deals like the Replica deal can breathe a new practice of transparency in keeping a better track of those records and how this data is used and what replicas and what models, etc., etc. And if we could see that practice of transparency flow to other parts of voice work in the video games industries, that would be a win, I think. Because if you don't know how your work is used, how are you going to know whether you're being exploited, whether your terms are being respected, whether the bargain you've made is good? You can't. So transparency is the start. Should be a given, but let's start with it if we've not been used to it so far.
Sure. And SAG have said in their press releases that they're actively working on other deals with AI companies. You sort of raised that one, Mathilde. Be interesting to know who for what type of work.
Yes.
Yeah.
What type of work, which area? Because AI in the creative industries, or AI with, acting work, can be so varied and wide-ranging, and some of it, like much of it, really exciting. But it needs to come on the books, and it needs to be regulated, and there need to be safeguards that work for the company and work for the performers. Because as you said, I think the legal uncertainty shrouding this space doesn't work for anyone.
Absolutely.
Fair summary then? Pretty good sum up, I'd say.
I mean, only time will tell whether SAG is setting the course to new standards with its alleged groundbreaking Replica deal, or whether actually the bar is going to be, raised for the better by other unions or even other companies finding out new, better ways to pay performers in a way that works for them.
This is what worries me, though. This is what worries me is that if SAG, I think it's going to be very hard. I think the bar that SAG sets is going to be the one that's imposed on other unions. And obviously working for a separate union in the UK, I don't know if it'd be easy. I don't know if SAG make a deal whether it's going to be easy for equity to negotiate something better. That worries me. So I think SAG is sort of, they are out there in the front of the battlefield, and we've just got to hope they get it right.
We will, as we have already mentioned, be tackling the wider SAG-AFTRA deal, the one that followed the Hollywood strike. If you have got questions, whether they are about that or about today's episode or anything else within our sphere of AI and performers' rights, then do please get in touch.
And yes, we'd love to hear from you. Search for us at LHV Podcast on Instagram or X, and follow us if you haven't done so already.
And if you've enjoyed listening, please do give us a review online. We'll be back in a couple of weeks. In the meantime, thanks for listening to The Last Human Voice.